Good evening, everyone. Tonight, KWWL Television is proud to present an informative look back at the history of the original Blackhawk Broadcasting Company, which started KWWL Television and led to Iowa's News Channel and the creation of the R.J. McElroy Trust. Tonight's program has been produced by the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting, located at Wartburg College in Waverly. Their preservation of the history of broadcasting across the entire state of Iowa is certainly commendable. And the funding for tonight's program is being provided by the R.J. McElroy Trust. Now, without commercial interruption, we are proud to present to you tonight a legacy of trust, the Blackhawk Broadcasting Company story.
The following program is a production of the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are indeed very proud this afternoon on November 15th, 1953, to be able to project this initial test pattern to you.
At 52 years old, as I say, without anything else really to prove to myself about practicing law, here was a whole new challenge.
And if you have management and ownership behind the news department who supports them, then you have an ideal situation. And this is what Bob Buckmaster was putting together.
But I walked in and said, I can do the job better than the guy you got doing it. And they said, okay, you can do that.
Good afternoon, I'm Kathy Spillman.
I'm Ron Steele reporting live tonight from the National Cattle Congress.
Also some surprising numbers for student enrollment.
In the weather, I'll have a forecast for the first day of fall.
What could we put on here that would attract people to come and see our place? So I thought, by Jove, we could do an art show.
So let's get right to the business of hand. Dave, let me begin with you tonight.
I was aggressive. I didn't want to get beat. And I'm still like that today.
This is a story about a media company that was more than just a business. It became an institution with a legacy which reaches into hundreds of communities and thousands of lives, extending well beyond the life of the business. A group of local investors organized the Blackhawk Broadcasting Company to operate a small radio station. The company grew and became an example of the kind of entrepreneurship which sees its responsibility as reaching beyond profitability to inform and serve the public. It was the work of hundreds of people, but they were guided by the leadership of two exceptional men. R.J. McElroy and Robert Buckmaster were dramatically different in background, personality, and management style. But each man made a unique contribution to the kind of success which is embodied in this story and the legacy which it established.
We're Iowa's News Channel, 7 and you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my distinct privilege at this time to speak the first words which will officially launch a new radio voice onto the airwaves.
Spoken by R.J. McElroy, those words were heard on KWWL, a new Waterloo radio station which began broadcasting on November 2nd, 1947. It would become the foundation of the Blackhawk Broadcasting Company.
KWWL is owned by 31 civic-minded and public-spirited citizens of Waterloo and Cedar Falls, and it is their desire that I dedicate this radio station in the service of all those within hearing of its voice to a better way of life through enlightenment.
Although he would not live to experience its complete fulfillment, R.J. McElroy's pledge in that initial broadcast to serve a better way of life through enlightenment would substantially be achieved through the media company he founded and the charitable foundation which became its lasting legacy. You know, R.J. McElroy started his own radio broadcasting business up there on the mezzanine level of the Russell Lamson building in downtown Waterloo. At the time, he already was an established personality in one of early radio's most popular formats, the daily Man on the Street program. However, the road to that achievement had been a rocky one until the door to his media career was opened by William B. Quarton, one of Iowa's most distinguished broadcasting executives. You know, R.J. McElroy had a difficult childhood. He left school and his Wisconsin home as a teenager to go out on his own. He started as a stock boy as a teenager for the Woolworth dime store chain, but by the 1930s, the enterprising young man had advanced to the position of assistant manager for their store in downtown Cedar Rapids. It was just around the corner from the storefront where Art Shepard, WMT Radio's celebrated man on the street, talked to passersby. On bad days, when it was hard to get someone to stop and talk, McElroy was only too happy to oblige.
Mac did such a good job that, and we were doing so well with this program that we duplicated it up in Waterloo.
That's how Mac got started in the man on the
That's how
street.
Mac got started in the business.
Here in downtown Waterloo, where WMT Radio already operated its remote studios, R.J. McElroy, using this very microphone, set up his shop on the corner of the Blacks building for his version of the Man on the Street program, which also became very popular.
But we've got a lot of people down here, and I know you want to hear them. Here's a gentleman here. Will you tell us your name, sir?
Laverne Rader.
Where do you live?
Ojai.
Oh, I know. A nice city. Would you name us 10 big news stories of 1935?
Mac passed out little loaves of clean-made bread while using his gift of gab to engage those who gathered around him in conversation, as people at home listened on the radio. The show moved with him to his own radio station when KWWL went on the air, and he continued it for several years after his growing media empire expanded to include television. However, TV was 6 years in the future at the time of the inaugural broadcast for his radio station, on which McElroy introduced several personalities who would join him on KWWL Radio's entertainment roster. One of them was Lyle Harvey, a musician and homespun character known to the public as Joe Dokes.
Presenting Joe Dokes, his accordion, and his band.
The Joe Dokes Band was just one of many entertainment shows on Waterloo's new radio station. But much of KWWL Radio's success was based on local news and a deep involvement with the community.
Actually, much of the station's progress actually was based on those news programs. We had a program called School of the Air, which I directed for quite some time. That also helped establish a reputation.
The Iowa Public Service Company presents the School of the Air. Now here is today's student announcer, Ross Bachtel.
Today we have with us the West High School Band.
However, it was the news department's extensive coverage of events close to home that cemented the news station's success. And in contrast to McElroy's heavy hand in everything else at the station, Ed Falk ran the news coverage.
He did not interfere with it. He might interfere with schedules, money, everything else, but as far as the news programs were concerned, I controlled.
One of Ed Falk's innovations was a full-hour news block at 7 a.m. This became must-listening for the KWWL audience. This newscast reported everything from births and deaths to events at City Hall, the courthouse, and the school board. In later years, it was anchored by a colorful newsman everybody knew as Eldon. When the newscast was over at 8 o'clock, Eldon would leave the newsroom to work his sources on the local beats.
And once you build up that rapport, you'll be fed information that you can use at a later time. And when that works, bingo. Mm-hmm. You open the door, you're on the inside, you know what's going on. Always carry the camera, because I never knew what was going to happen.
Ebert's reference to carrying a film camera on his beats moves the Blackhawk story into the revolutionary change television brought to the middle of the 20th century. In Waterloo, that transition would revolve around the battle for Channel 7 between McElroy and Joe Dumond, another media titan of the time. Dumond was also a graduate of the early WMT radio experience. The Josh Higgins character he portrayed originally on WMT took him to the big time on the NBC radio network. He returned to his native Blackhawk County in 1941 and put KXEL on the air in Waterloo.
Hello, kids, I never expected this. It looks
By the early 1950s, the new electronic device which brought pictures as well as sound into our homes was starting to explode across the country. And the clamor for television was rising in Northeast Iowa, where 7 had been assigned as the TV channel which would serve the area in and around Waterloo. But the wheels of the Federal Communications Commission ground slowly on the licensing of new television stations. Joe Dumont decided to speed things up. Confident of his standing in the community and his political connections in Washington, Dumont constructed a new building on the east edge of Waterloo where he moved his radio station. However, a large studio space and much of the building clearly was designed to house a television station. In fact, he advertised it as the KXEL Radio Television Center. The problem was KXEL did not have the license the FCC required to build and operate a TV station. In the meantime, McElroy and his business associates also decided to get into television. He and Lyle Harvey are pictured mailing KWWL's application for Channel 7 to Washington. That set up a contest for the license, which would have to be decided by the FCC. It threatened to delay television service to the area and ignited a huge controversy. The debate made the round of service clubs, and one of those forums was an exchange club meeting in a room at the President Hotel. In his speech to the members, Joe Dumont took the offensive.
And I'm going to be honest. On behalf of Waterloo, on behalf of you, we filed an application and bought equipment. We have it now. It can be here in a matter of days. That will bring you television. Now, the proposal made by the other people is strictly a paper proposal.
You know, as he spoke, what Joe Dumont did not know was that the KWWL Board of Directors had met in that room earlier in the day, and two of McElroy's employees had left a microphone concealed in the room. With the tape locked away in a safe deposit box, McElroy's attorneys filed a lawsuit which accused KXEL of conspiracy, restraint of trade, and violation of FCC regulations. The trial went forward in the summer of 1953. When the secretly recorded Dumont tape came into evidence, the handwriting was on the wall.
When that came out in the lawsuit by McElroy and Joe Dumont got together and
went for a ride.
And when they came back from the ride, Joe Dumont withdrew his application, and KWWL Channel 7 became the new tenant of the building that had been prematurely erected out east of town.
With the settlement and withdrawal of KXEL's application, Judge Henry Graven approved KWWL's motion to dismiss the lawsuit. The FCC quickly approved McElroy's now uncontested application for Channel 7, and he threw the switch which put Channel 7 on the air on November 28, 1953, using equipment KXEL had ordered in a walled-off section of Dumont's new building, which was leased to KWWL. That moment thrust the hard-charging McElroy into television, a far more complex business than he had encountered up to that point. However, the expense side of operating a small radio station was dwarfed by what it cost to operate a television station, and the advertising revenue was slim. McElroy, pictured here with his TV staff in the early days, would have difficulty coming to grips with that. Under Mac's iron hand, the station which brought television to Waterloo on that November day in 1953 would be a lean operation. In his brief history of the Blackhawk Broadcasting Company, Warren Mead, the company's vice president of public affairs, provided some graphic descriptions of just how lean the television operation was. We purchased a magnificent line of photo equipment, one Bell & Howell 16mm film camera, one 4x5 speed graphic, and 3 black and white Polaroids. That was it, not only for news, but for the total operation. However, with the benefit of the NBC network programming and a huge public appetite for television, McElroy managed to grow the business and moved Channel 7 from the KXEL building to the downtown location where it remains today. The ground floor of the building at 4th and Franklin became a TV studio where live car commercials were a big part of expanding the advertising revenue stream, which was the economic lifeblood of the business. Furniture commercials were also done live, even when the merchandise was displayed in tiers, according to the man on the left, John Drilling, one of the early announcers at Channel 7.
You had to get it right the first time.
Drilling also recalled doing live beer commercials with some off-camera assistance from the sports anchor.
And when they came back, the beer glass would be empty.
Okay.
Well, I couldn't drink the beer on the air.
That was against the rules.
So I'd hand it over to Jack. And Jack would drink the beer, toss it off, and then hand me the empty glass.
Drilling also hosted an after-school dance for teens 5 afternoons a week in the Channel 7 studio, which on Sunday afternoons was the scene of professional wrestling. Drilling was the play-by-play announcer. Perhaps because of his versatility, he also doubled as a radio disc jockey. Drilling was one of the few people who enjoyed any long-term employment status at KWWL. Given McElroy's personnel practices, the majority of the personalities who showed up on Channel 7 were not there very long. Dwayne Hunting was one of them. A qualified meteorologist who worked for Braniff Airways, Hunting was hired to moonlight as Channel 7's weatherman. For a fee of $3.50 a program, he did the weather on Channel 7's 6 and 10 p.m. newscasts. In 1998, Hunting sat down with Craig Johnson in the Channel 7 Weather Center to talk about his experience 45 years earlier. After a couple of years, Hunting told McElroy he thought his experience justified a raise.
Finally, one day I did get a hold of him, and I told him, I said, I really would like to have a raise. I said, and he said, well, you know, he says, I believe at 3.5 a show. He says, we could have one of our own people do it. And that was it. I was done. I didn't do another show.
Hunting was just one in a parade of weather, news, and sports personnel who rotated through the revolving door on the Channel 7 anchor desk during the McElroy years. However, the McElroy years were coming to a close as Channel 7 moved into its second decade. American television was developing rapidly. By the mid-60s, it had become the dominant entertainment medium in the United States. It also emerged as the primary source of news. Americans gathered around television to mourn the assassination of a young president.
That President Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, which is about 35 minutes ago.
Many viewers in Northeast Iowa saw this tragedy unfold on NBC and KWWL Channel 7, the television station established by the man who came out of such humble beginnings and struggled against huge odds. He now headed a growing company. Blackhawk owned radio and television stations in Austin, Minnesota, as well as KWWL radio and television. The founder, R.J. McElroy, died suddenly in 1965. On that day in 1965, no one could have foreseen the magnitude of the legacy that would grow out of the media business, which was established by R.J. McElroy in 1947. As the torch of leadership of the Blackhawk Broadcasting Company was passed on to Robert Buckmaster, he inherited two fundamentals of the legacy of trust put in place by R.J. McElroy. The first was a business which was dedicated to a better way of life through enlightenment, and a will which made it possible for a substantial portion of McElroy's estate to be used for the benefit of deserving young people. Achievement of the second objective would be carried out by the foundation which bears McElroy's name. However, the work of the R.J. McElroy Trust was made possible by the business success of the company under the management of Robert Buckmaster. He achieved that by building public trust in KWWL's news and programming services. And that formula for success was defined by two highly successful media executives whose combined experience spans 7 decades.
I think a couple of things are true about how to be successful as a local broadcaster. You have to have a top-notch news operation. It has to have credibility. The people have to accept that what you're doing is the best.
You've got to be part of the community way up to the hilt. And that sometimes is the difference between success and the also-ran station.
News and Community Service was the programming concept on which Bill Quarton had built the powerhouse WMT radio and television stations. WMT TV Channel 2 was the competitive obstacle McElroy was not able to overcome. and it was a challenge which Buckmaster took on. It was a radical shift for the man who had already established his reputation as a brilliant trial attorney. Buckmaster grew up under the shadow of his father, the unconventional country doctor whose personality dominated the Black Hawk County community of Dunkerton, where Robert was raised. His life was rooted deep in American values and the soil of Iowa. As a boy living in this small town where he learned to fish in the stream which flows through it and across the beauty of Iowa's rural landscape, Buckmaster would have the educational advantages McElroy did not have. He graduated from what is now the University of Northern Iowa and went on to earn his law degree from the University of Iowa with distinction. The small-town life of his boyhood was far behind him on that fateful day in 1965 when the growing but still struggling Black Hawk Broadcasting Company lost its founder and president. Buckmaster was an original investor and an active member of the board of directors. However, he was a very busy attorney and was not involved in the day-to-day management of the company or Channel 7, the flagship television station.
I thought, well, I'd come over, and if I didn't like it or didn't work, 6 months, I hadn't lost him, I could go back. But I had serious reservations, because all I'd ever wanted to be was a trial lawyer. As you say, I mean, I had reached a point where I proved everything to myself that I had to prove about it. And I found, as a matter of fact, here was a whole new challenge.
Buckmaster's commitment to his new career was total, but the challenge confronting him was huge.
I walked into a news department. They weren't doing very well. The ratings were horrible. The people in Black Hawk County didn't even watch Channel 7. It was kind of a joke. And this was the very thing that they were talking about that they wanted to change.
Peterson's description in terms of ratings meant that Channel 2's 10 p.m. news audience was double the size of the combined audience of Channel 7 and Channel 9, the other two stations in the market. In the television business, it takes ratings to produce advertising income. And the new head of the Black Hawk Broadcasting Company clearly had his work cut out for him. However, his immediate approach was to recruit a corporate staff which knew more about television than he did. His choice to become corporate executive vice president was a Southern gentleman who recalled as his guiding principle a broadcasting concept now largely forgotten.
Public trust. That what we were trying to do, okay, is remember that always had to be. It's a business, and yes, we wanted to make money, but we never wanted to lose sight of it, that this is the airways belong to the public.
Jim Bradley brought 12 years of programming and production experience at a Virginia television station to Channel 7 when he came to Iowa to join Buckmaster's management team in 1965. He lost no time pinpointing the problem and laying out a new strategy.
The main theme is that, first of all, we had to take WMT on. We have to compete with them every place we can. And I said, the major thing that's wrong with KWWL is this revolving door you have here. You've got to get some people in here that we keep, that the audience can turn on and identify with.
That would turn out to be Tom Peterson, an experienced broadcast journalist, sports director Mike O'Connor, and a young high school student named Jim Ganal, who walked in and convinced Jim Bradley to give him a chance to prove what he could do as the Channel 7 weatherman.
He just said, well, the guy that we had just quit. So, okay. It was kind of a novel approach to put somebody on who was 17, and I was a local person for Waterloo. WMT dominated the market, so I thought, well, try put some local flavor on here and see if it could make a difference.
Over time, it did make a difference. Peterson, Ganal, and O'Connor became the familiar personalities who were there every night on the Channel 7 News in more and more Northeast Iowa households. They were backed up by a team of field reporters and photographers covering the news throughout the area the station served. Brian Ross was one of the aggressive young reporters who was on the cutting edge of that new effort. He described it as an exciting time.
It was, and hired just a bunch of young guys like me. Everything to beat Channel 2, get there first. We have the police scanners. We chase the auto accidents, chase the tornadoes, chase whatever it was. Drive all day, charter flights.
Buckmaster had the vision, I think, with his astute legal mind, and he'd traveled a lot too. And he had a real sense of community and how journalism lent itself to what he found very important, and that was the law. Stood behind us when people wanted news in Waterloo, Iowa to be news candy instead of true journalism, and he would go to bat for us on legal issues, and we were a very aggressive newsroom.
We had done a few documentaries, a thing called Inside Out about the Iowa prison system, and when we decided, let's try to do something on a weekly basis. For a local broadcast entity in a medium market situation, that's pretty aggressive, and that goes back, I think, to the fact that Bob Buckmaster was highly motivated and was willing to take risks and spend the money to do that.
Bob Buckmaster also laid down a bright line between the news department's journalistic responsibilities and the commercial side of the business.
I don't have to tell you that policy of our company is that the news department operates separately from the business office.
News management under Robert Buckmaster's operating philosophy was the responsibility of the news director. In the early stages of the drive to make Channel 7 competitive, the man who held that job was George Lipper, a no-nonsense journalist who knew how to cover the news and break the big stories. George Lipper was succeeded by Blake Kellogg, a television journalist who brought a new dimension to the KWWL news effort with his understanding of how to use pictures to support content. When Blake Kellogg moved on, the responsibilities of news director were added to Tom Peterson's duties, and he continued to anchor the 10 p.m. news. Channel 7 was starting to win the battle for news viewers. Channel 2 still led the 10 p.m. news in the 1970 Nielsen ratings book with 73,000 households viewing, but Channel 7 registered 40,000 now, almost double the size of the 10 p.m. audience just 5 years earlier. In 1972, Grant Price, who had managed the Channel 2 news operation for more than a decade, left WMT and joined Buckmaster's corporate management team as Vice President of News and Public Affairs.
KWWL Television, Waterloo, Cedar Rapids.
The effort to make Channel 7 competitive was centered on developing a professional news operation. However, the station also ventured into other types of locally produced programming. In addition to his weather duties, Jim Ganal hosted a program called Community Quiz, which allowed teams of students from area schools to compete against each other on television.
We would have to think up our questions, and we made them up very similar to a Jeopardy kind of a board at the time.
Another innovation at KWWL programming was an early attempt at using television for early childhood education.
By looking at it, can you guess what I used for the back?
A cotton and...
No, for the back, the big part.
A box. A box.
What kind of box?
A top of...
Right, a top from a shoebox, and that's what our picture is today, a shoebox picture.
The program Romper Room was formatted and syndicated nationally, but it was also produced live at the TV station with local children in the studio. And it was hosted by a young professional teacher, Bonnie Noonan, known to her audience as Miss Bonnie. Another corporate innovation was the development of a Blackhawk-owned production and advertising agency under the title Carnaby Square. Carnaby Square created commercials and programming to serve clients as well as the television station. Jim Bradley's decision to invest in a mobile production van for Carnaby Square opened unique opportunities. One of them was described by the young man who had started his career as a camera operator at Channel 7 and was selected to manage this new unit.
When this all came together, it was just really prior to the Today Show saying, let's celebrate the centennial in 1975 and 76 by recording every state on location. And we had the opportunity to do about a dozen states, which was pretty cool. Barbara Walters came out here.
You know, it's a funny thing about Iowa, the poet Paul Engel said to me.
Barbara's appearance on that NBC Today Show broadcast to the nation from the John Miller Farm south of Cedar Falls on an October morning in 1975 and was originated by Channel 7's Carnaby Square mobile production unit. Carnaby Square would later figure in a huge programming success for the television station. In the meantime, the battle to dominate the news ratings continued. I joined Tom Peterson and Jim Ganal on the Channel 7 anchor team. Grant Price hired me to replace Mike O'Connor as sports director when Mike left to get into the radio ownership business. In November of 1975, for the very first time, the Nielsen rating book showed Channel 7 leading Channel 2 on the 10 p.m. news. It was by the minuscule margin of just 1,000 households. However, Channel 2 would continue to lead at 6 for another 4 years. But in 1979, 14 years after Robert Buckmaster set his sights on making KWWL television competitive in the market, his station was #1 on both the 6 and 10 p.m. newscasts, a trend which would continue and grow for years. The new ratings profile in the market reflected the fact that over those 14 years, the audience had learned to trust the journalism which was being practiced at Channel 7 by the news team pictured here in the mid-70s. Those of us who have had the privilege and responsibility of coming into people's homes on a daily basis as the newscast anchors, in effect become the personalities of the station, the human connection that viewers identify with and cements station loyalty. Well, as the decade of the 70s moved into the 80s, a new anchor team would evolve at Channel 7. Longtime anchor Tom Peterson left to pursue some other opportunities, and Tom would become the longtime news director at WGN, one of Chicago's premier radio stations. And I applied to succeed Tom in the news anchor chair, and I can tell you that idea was greeted with a lot of skepticism because in those days, the sports to news anchor promotion simply had not worked out in the other markets. However, the Channel 7 management team decided to give it a try, and 28 years later, I'm still here. As the new team took shape over the next several years, my place in sports was filled by Bob Hogue, who became famous as the voice of Iowa Hawkeye basketball and later a state senator in the Hawaii state legislature. I was joined on the other side of the desk by a meteorologist with a name which was synonymous with weather and professionalism. In addition to his weather reports on the daily newscast, Craig Johnson's marathon vigils informing Northeast Iowans in time of severe weather became a hallmark of Channel 7's commitment to keeping the public informed.
KWWL Television, Waterloo, Cedar Rapids. This is the News Center 7 10 o'clock report. The latest news, weather, and sports from Iowa's largest broadcast news organization, the Blackhawk Broadcasting Company.
Good evening. The Iraqi President Hussein said today that his country would accept a United Nations-backed ceasefire if Iran would also adhere to a ceasefire appeal. In that 1980 newscast, the front line on the Channel 7 news staff was still an all-male cast. Up to this point in the entire history of broadcasting, with very rare exceptions, women had been shut out of on-air positions in both radio and television. That was starting to change, and my longtime colleague Liz Mathis would be a key player in the change at Channel 7. Liz joined the KWWL staff shortly after graduating from the University of Iowa with a degree in broadcast journalism. Liz was assigned as a reporter-photographer covering news from the Cedar Rapids Bureau. A 1982 management decision brought Liz into the Waterloo newsroom to join Craig, Bob, and me on the anchor team.
And I got along great with Ron. We kind of grew up together, you know, and I really watched what he was doing, that, you know, the good things, and I picked up some of the bad things too, like going up to the very last minute, you know, and wanting to get that story on instead of maybe reading my copy like I should have been. But we seemed to kind of play off of each other and that energy, and I just so appreciated him and loved working with him, and we were competitive.
It was just a lot of fun, Grant. It really was. I mean, we really liked each other. We really were competitive. The friendships that we developed were really important. The fact that we wanted to win. We were very competitive, and we knew what it took to win. We worked together. The people made a connection. I think that's the main thing. When you make that connection with the people, they really like that. I mean, it's almost a subconscious thing in a way, but they start beginning to depend on you and trust you, and I think that really makes all the difference. That competitive intensity and total journalistic commitment to getting the story and getting it right, which the entire staff shared, was at the heart of the trust which the audience came to place in KWWL News. Women were becoming full participants in this process, but it had been a struggle.
Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Spillman.
Kathy Spielman was the first woman to anchor a major newscast in the Waterloo-Cedar Rapids television market. In her farewell newscast at Channel 7 in 1981, Kathy Spielman handed off the anchor to Pam Hildebrand Grimes.
This is kind of a combination happy, sad day for me.
It sure is. It is for me, too.
Yeah. I'm happy because there's going to be great opportunities ahead. I'm sad because I'm going to be leaving the new newscast. And another thing that makes me very happy is that Pam Hildebrand is going to be doing it.
Pam Hildebrand Grimes, now a news producer at WGN Television in Chicago, recalled being encouraged and inspired by Kathy Spielman's achievements in the early phases of her television journalism career.
Kathy Spielman was there shortly before I was there. She was a reporter, television reporter, and an anchor woman. She was anchoring the noon show. She was maybe 3 years older than I was, but I totally admired her work. I would watch every minute of KWWL because I thought, she is so good.
Before her career moved on to much larger markets 10 years later, Hildebrand Grimes had done it all at Channel 7. The uniqueness of the Blackhawk Broadcasting Company's success was built on the trust that audiences came to have in the station's news broadcasts. However, the impact of daily news coverage was supported strongly by that other dimension of local station success, community outreach. Commitment to serving the public reached deep into the fabric of the communities the station served and their citizens. Blackhawk was operated as a company which really believed the licenses to broadcast held by its stations were a public trust. The principle that Blackhawk Broadcasting Company stations were committed to serving the public was there from the beginning at KWWL Radio 60 years ago. However, its importance was amplified exponentially by the communication power which television brought to the electronic messenger, and it was employed vigorously by Robert Buckmaster and his team. Blackhawk Broadcasting Company stations were accessible as a community forum through a wide range of public affairs programming.
Our Iowa Illustrated special report this evening, Harvesting Fear.
The Iowa Illustrated series, referred to earlier by Judge James Gritzner, dealt with the most complex issues of the times. This episode, for example, was an expose of right-wing extremist groups which at the time were preying on Iowa farmers caught in the 1980s farm depression. These were program-length reports displayed in prime time. David Sparks succeeded Jim Gritzner as the program's second producer.
We actually understood that program to be investigatory journalism, to take stories that were just too big for the evening news, even if presented as a series of stories, topics that simply needed to be developed and presented in a single go.
Hello and welcome to Focal Point. With us today, Jim Smith of the Waterloo Art Association and Warren Mead, former executive with this television station.
Focal Point was another staple of Channel 7's public affairs commitment. It was a weekly studio discussion program regarded as a valuable resource by community leaders.
And I tell you that every Sunday morning, you had something on there that was that would reflect something in our community. They had an opportunity to see what happens and what some people are doing or organizations are doing in our community. It was a great program.
To get a spot on a television station that told about your organization and not have to pay for it was it's just invaluable. And Focal Points were excellent.
Once a year, Focal Point was the program host for a community art show, which was sponsored by KWWL Television and the Waterloo Art Association. It was the brainchild of Warren Mead, Blackhawk Broadcasting Company's longtime Vice President of Public Affairs.
So when we got this new building downtown, I thought, over the Labor Day weekend, nothing goes on in the studio. What could we put on here that would attract people to come and see our place? So I thought, by Jove, we could do an art show.
Fielding questions tonight, Jim Olmsted, Vice President Engineering, Jim Waterbury, President and General Manager of KWWL.
Another of Warren Mead's innovations, which connected strongly with Channel 7's audience, was a program called Broadcasting and You. 4 times a year following the Sunday night news, management from top corporate officers on down would gather in the studio and answer questions phoned in by viewers for 90 minutes. No question relevant to the station and its programming was off limits.
One of the most difficult crimes to prosecute is a sex offense against a child.
Issues and events in the news, many of them highly controversial, were the subject matter of the station editorials seen regularly on Channel 7. The CEO at the time, Robert Buckmaster, presented them himself until he retired, and then Grant Price became the editorial voice of the television station. However, KWWL's viewpoints were always a consensus opinion formulated by an editorial board made up of top corporate managers and news and public affairs executives. As far back as 1981, the Channel 7 editorial board, in a 3-part editorial series, was advocating development of an ethanol industry in the state of Iowa. Now, 26 years later, biofuels are seen as a major component of what the United States must do to cut its dependence on foreign oil, and Iowa now leads the nation in ethanol production.
Tonight, University of Northern Iowa students talk about the disease that some people are afraid to talk about.
Thank you, Madeline McFadden, reporting live tonight from Cedar Falls. Here in our KWWL studios, News Center 7 reporters Tammy Weinsek and Lori Jewett will help question our expert panelists this evening. Our moderator tonight is the Vice President for News and Public Affairs here at KWWL, Grant Price.
Good evening and welcome to what we hope will be your town meeting.
Channel 7 was also far ahead of the wave in the 1980s in recognizing the significance of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which was just beginning to explode around the world. At the time, it was little understood and directly affected only a handful of people in a rural state such as Iowa. However, Channel 7 took on the issue in a 2-hour prime-time live town meeting.
A comment I heard a long time ago by a veteran newspaper editor has always stuck in my mind. Ask what it takes to make a really great news organization. He said, "You have got to have heart." I think that was demonstrated at Channel 7 in a feature we called Iowa's Child. The idea was to bring hard-to-adopt children to the attention of prospective parents through stories we asked Ron to produce.
First, we had to get official state approval to put these children on television. It was a serendipitous moment in 1981 when Grant and I approached Sally Cross of the Department of Human Services to see if we could get permission to do just that. At the time, Sally was a DHS official who supervised adoptions in the Waterloo-Cedar Falls area.
When I first went into the field, everything was secret. And of course, 95% were looking for the cute baby boy or girl. But our real need was for these older children. And when the opportunity came to do a public thing on it, I was tickled to death.
Sally Cross authorized the first 5 children we ever featured on Iowa's Child. These stories ran as part of our newscast. For example, we told Gabe's story 16 years later. Gabe got his wish for his forever family. He is one of the more than 200 children who came to the attention of adoptive parents who took them into their families after seeing them on Iowa's Child on News Center 7. In the summer of 2000, the New York Times ran a story which was headlined, "Brash, Hard-Driving Cable Executive Steers CNBC to the Top of Cable News." That New York Times headline referred to a man named Bill Bolster, whose media career started at the Blackhawk Broadcasting Company. Bill Bolster was managing Channel 7 in the 1980s when he came up with an idea which started him on the path to senior management at NBC.
This is a special sports presentation of the Iowa Television Network.
Bolster's idea was to create a network of 5 television stations which would blanket the entire state of Iowa with live telecasts of University of Iowa Hawkeye basketball games. It coincided in the era in which Lute Olson's teams were competing to the top tier of the Big Ten Conference and the NCAA. Bill Bolster and Harry Slife, who succeeded Bob Buckmaster as president of the company, negotiated a contract with the University of Iowa and put together a consortium of TV stations which launched a series of telecasts. These games were originated by Channel 7's Carnaby Square production unit.
Oh, my!
KWWL sports director Bob Hogue called the play-by-play for these telecasts. His familiar, "Oh my!" exclamation became the trademark of these telecasts, which achieved unprecedented ratings. Up to 80% of all Iowans watching television on game nights were tuned in to Lute Olson's Iowa Hawkeyes on the Iowa Television Network stations. These broadcasts reached an audience which was comparable in size to the St. Louis market, the 14th largest television market in the country.
So I called up somebody and I said, well, what does St. Louis television station that did a 70 rating and an 80 share with an event, what would they get in pricing? That's how I decided how much to sell it for. And my God, it was millions of dollars, you know, and we're running this literally out of a Winnebago with some tape machines and through KWWL, and it was a marketing tool. It was a feel-good. It was good for Iowa. Lute and I were invited to be co-best men at an old people's home from two people that met watching the Hawks.
The Iowa Television Network was a crowning example of Blackhawk's central operating principle: succeed in business by providing quality service to the public. It was one of the many, many connections to the community, which by the end of the decade of the 1980s made Channel 7 the overwhelmingly dominant television station in the entire Cedar Rapids-Waterloo market. The Nielsen report in 1989 showed the audience watching Channel 7's 6 and 10 evening newscasts was now double that of the other two stations. The business success which R.J. McElroy and Robert Buckmaster achieved, each in his own way, was the economic engine which powered the final legacy in this story, the McElroy Trust.
This story was a compilation of incredibly talented people that came together at a very short period of time and put together something very special. And it was corporate, it was family, it was community. It was real. That whole thing started really as a result of Mac's benevolence, which maybe people close to him didn't sense. He was very benevolent, and he was benevolent in the largest sense of the word, in community.
That was the characteristic which McElroy and Dr. Buckmaster's father shared, a deep sense of community. That philosophy was molded into perpetuity by Mac's last will and testament and the legal documents which were crafted to carry out his wishes. They were administered by the trustees of the charitable foundation which bears his name. And today, the McElroy Trust is the third largest private foundation in Iowa with assets of more than $50 million. It started with the radio station which Mac dedicated to enlightenment on the day it began broadcasting 60 years ago. This is the original balance sheet for the company formed to operate KWWL. It was capitalized at just $45,000. 33 years later, the Blackhawk Broadcasting Company owned 3 highly profitable television stations, 4 radio stations, and several non-broadcasting businesses. When it was sold in 1980, its value was $47 million. The R.J. McElroy estate owned 51% of the stock, but that did not just happen. It was the work of Bob Buckmaster, Bob Young, and Dr. Tom Trinnell, the original trustees of the estate, and their successors, and Bob Buckmaster's law partner, W. Lewis Beecher. The last of the original giants still standing, Lewis Beecher did the legal work which made it all possible. Although R.J. McElroy was living fairly well at the time of his death, there was virtually no cash in his estate. Under the terms of the original incorporation of Blackhawk, McElroy held an option to purchase half the value of the company for $25,000. However, he had never exercised it. So Buckmaster and Beecher, acting as executor and attorney, borrowed $25,000 and then used it to exercise the option on behalf of the estate. So when the will was probated, the estate owned half the company. Beecher then won a 3-year-long lawsuit contesting the amount of the estate tax assessed by the IRS. Beecher also negotiated an arrangement with the agency which made the McElroy Trust a tax-exempt foundation. It involved a settlement with the individuals named in the will who were still living, that being Mac's sister, his widow, and her son.
We made a cash settlement, substantial, and that's how it got qualified as a tax-free institution. So when the company sold for $47 million, everybody else had to pay tax on it, but the McElroy Trust or Foundation, whatever you want to call it, was a tax-free entity. We got it framed so that it was.
Yeah.
So it paid no tax. Mac's $25,000 had ballooned to $22 million,
right,
with no tax.
Yeah.
And that's what got the McElroy Trust going.
Under the terms of McElroy's will, after making provision for his family, the mission of the trustees in administering his estate was defined by these words: use all of the income from the R.J. McElroy Trust as then constituted for the benefit of deserving young people.
One of the joys of being on the McElroy Trust is that the trust under them, and really under this present generation, I think, is always flexible. We really believe strongly in what the trust document says, which is the present generation of trustees is responsible for administering the trust.
From the beginning, in their funding decisions, the trustees have interpreted their mandate broadly to include institutions which benefit young people both directly and indirectly. As a result, McElroy's legacy of benevolence has supported developing the potential of thousands of young Iowans through scholarships and the grants which the Trust has awarded over the years to a wide variety of educational institutions, social agencies, libraries, and cultural programs.
The list of programs that have benefited from the McElroy Trust extends from the youngest preschooler to the most talented college student. And the breadth of that across all of these counties in Northeast Iowa, it truly is unique.
Professor Jeff Stein, who heads the electronic media teaching program at Wartburg College, has a unique perspective on the legacy, personally and professionally. As a student, Jeff received a McElroy-supported scholarship. He now holds the McElroy Endowed Faculty Chair in the Communication Arts Department at Wartburg, and he teaches the students of today who benefit from the program.
To come to work every day as the McElroy Chair, to work in the McElroy Communication Arts Center, which has provided our students in mass media tremendous opportunities, to go to the R.J. McElroy archives to work with the history of the medium. It's a very special thing, and it shows how important the legacy that was created by R.J. McElroy, the Blackhawk Broadcasting Company, and the Trust has come to be.
Another program funded by the Trust has a direct tie to the television station which McElroy founded. It's a paid internship which has given literally hundreds of students from Iowa colleges and universities who want to be broadcast journalists practical experience in a television newsroom. 2 members of the Wartburg College class of 2007 are among the most recent McElroy interns at KWWL. Casey Lensman and Jimmy Vowell have also done the videography and electronic editing for this production, and each received a McElroy scholarship during their student careers.
Now KWWL Sports.
Channel 7 sports director Rick Coleman was the first of many McElroy interns who have gone on to successful careers in television journalism. When he graduated from the University of Iowa in 1986, Rick Coleman became a full-time member of the Channel 7 news team.
It was my first job. Actually, my only job in the business has been here at KWWL TV. Graduating from part-time in high school to an intern in college, and now I've gone from the news department to sports. I started out as a videographer here back in 1987, and I went from that to a news reporter on weekends, and then eventually during the week, and then weekend sports and sports director.
Christopher Scholl represents another successful career path which started as a McElroy intern at Channel 7 in the 1980s. When he graduated from Drake University, Chris was hired as a reporter-photographer on the Channel 7 news staff. Later, he anchored the morning news and concluded his career at KWWL by doing investigative reporting, for which he won 2 national awards. That put him on a path to NBC News and the program Dateline, where Chris was a highly regarded producer. Today, Chris Scholl continues his work as a producer of investigative stories, working with national correspondents, reporting from the citadel of NBC News, the Washington Bureau in the city which is the global capital of news. Chris still spends an awful lot of time at his computer researching stories, and that was something he was one of the very first to do in the country as a reporter for Channel 7 long before the internet even existed.
It was the foundation. I mean, everything I did in Waterloo has come to help me today. From the everything from the computer stuff that I relied on then, that's much more sophisticated today. There's not a thing that I do now that doesn't somehow probably trace back to those days at KWWL.
The Gold Star Award for Outstanding Teaching is another example of how the philanthropy of the McElroy legacy has merged with the television station he founded. For the past 19 years, the Trust and KWWL Television have co-sponsored the program which honors and awards $1,000 to each of the 10 Blackhawk County educators who have been selected as Gold Star teachers. At the 2005 awards presentation, Channel 7 history flashed back more than 30 years to Miss Bonnie, KWWL's romper room teacher. Mrs. Bonnie Noonan, 6th grade teacher at Hanson Elementary School in Cedar Falls, was one of those called to the platform to receive the Gold Star Award for Outstanding Teaching.
This is Bonnie Noonan.
There is no way to measure the true impact the funding provided by the McElroy Trust has had on the thousands of lives it has touched over the past 3 decades. However, some appreciation of its scope and importance can be drawn from the statistics. In the period 1980 through 2006, grants to institutions and programs which benefit deserving young people throughout Northeast Iowa add up to more than $43 million. Throughout its most active years and until her untimely death in 2006, the staff administration of the work of the McElroy Trust was in the committed and capable hands of Executive Secretary Linda Klinger. In the 60 years since this story began, huge changes in broadcasting have taken place. One of them is deregulation and concentration of media ownership. Blackhawk, the company which nurtured the legacy of Trust, has experienced 3 changes of ownership. The most recent, within the past year, was when the media company Quincy Newspapers Incorporated acquired Channel 7. As this latest chapter in the story begins, the new owner's management philosophy strikes a familiar and welcome chord.
The role of a television station in the community, to me, is hinged on community service. So to be able to be in a community like this, working with a television station like KWWL, ownership like Quincy Newspapers Incorporated, who still believes that we serve the public interest in what we do, is a wonderful thing. Although Quincy Newspapers owns it and is headquartered in Quincy, Illinois, this station is run in Waterloo, Iowa, and I think that makes a huge difference.
The people we have told you about in this program are some of the major players in the significant role that Iowa broadcasters played in the communications revolution which radio and television brought to the 20th century. That revolution, of course, laid the groundwork for the instantaneous global communications universe we are all experiencing today and is propelling us through the 21st century at pretty much warp speed. But for those of us here in Northeast Iowa, it all began with broadcasting pioneers like R.J. McElroy and Robert Buckmaster, and the associates who worked with them to create this lasting legacy of trust.